Everyone, and welcome to another lesson. And this lesson, we're going to be focusing on the novel. Specifically, we're going to be talking about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which we've been reading over these past few weeks. Now, this novel is not just a ghost story. It's not only a scary story. It's really beautiful, layered narrative that blends a few things together. So horror, as you noticed, science fiction, and philosophy. And today we're going to be looking at the context, the content, and also some of its central themes. Okay, so first we're going to review some important historical context about Mary Shelley and the period in which she was writing. Next, we're going to highlight some key topics in the novel, maybe some recurring ideas that Shelley wants us to think about. And then lastly, we're going to look at some major themes and those deeper insights that the novel seems to explore through its storytelling. Okay, let's get started. All right, so let's start with the basics. Frankenstein 101. So the full title is Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus. It was written by Mary Shelley in 1818, and she began writing this story on vacation in the summer in Switzerland, and the novel setting kind of reflects that environment. We move throughout Switzerland, France, England, Scotland, and then we end in the Arctic. Now, structurally, it's told through a series of framed narratives. So we see letters, first-person accounts that layer these stories within the story. And now this structure can really help us think about what perspective is, how reliable our narrator may be or may not be, and how these stories are passed down, but also how they morph into different versions of that story. Okay. So to understand Romanticism and to understand Frankenstein, we really need to pair the two and look at them together. Now, Romanticism was a movement that celebrated emotion, imagination, the natural world, and it rejected Enlightenment. So this idea of rationalism and scientific progress, which was the ultimate goal. Now, Romantics believed in the power of the individual and the importance of personal experience. Now, you'll see this really clearly in Victor Frankenstein, who is very obsessive and emotional in his pursuit of knowledge and the consequences that follow. All right. Romanticism was partly a reaction to neoclassicism and Enlightenment thinking. Now, while the Enlightenment emphasized reason, order, Romantic arts and thinkers embraced this chaos, emotion, and the unknown. They turned away from tradition and instead looked inward, so inside, so our imagination, our dreams, the wildness of nature. Now you can see that reflected in the paintings here. We see perfect symmetry, these beautiful dramatic poses, these themes of war, power, and heroism. And it really reflects the Enlightenment ideals. So reason above emotion, progress through logic, and society governed by structure and universal laws, as you see here. Now, literature from this period followed strict forms and often praised civilization and control over nature. But Mary Shelley was writing at the tail end of this era, and she kind of starts to push against it. Romanticism, as we'll see, rejects this kind of rigid structure and seeks to find something messier, more emotional, more human. Now, Shelley's novel represents this clear break from traditional rational storytelling. She asks, what happens when humans try to control or transcend nature? Now, her story becomes almost this warning that unchecked ambition, even in the name of science, can destroy lives. And the novel really challenges readers to think about responsibility, morality, and the limits of human power. Now we see this painting here that reflects the Romanticism's break from Enlightenment ideals. So instead of glorifying civilization, it exalts the individual's emotional experience, especially when confronting the vast power of nature. As we see in this image, nature is at the forefront. It is the center. The figure in the painting is no longer in the center, and we see that the stormy sea and the expansive sky is this huge, untamable thing. Man is no longer the master of nature. In fact, it's actually vulnerable to it. Now, this change does a beautiful job of mirroring what Shelley was doing in Frankenstein. Victor tries to master nature by creating life. But as we see, nature pushes back, it resists. And of course, it ends in very devastating results. And Shelley's novel, like this painting, is really about human vulnerability and in the face of things that we don't really fully understand. Okay, let's talk about Gothic literature. Now, Frankenstein is a Gothic novel. Gothic literature often features these really gloomy settings, has supernatural elements, a lot of emotional intensity, and psychological horror. But Gothic emerges from this romantic context. So it is imbued with some of the characteristics, but it adds something a little bit more dark. So the image here captures key Gothic motifs. We have shadows, supernatural elements, and intense human suffering. You might even feel uncomfortable looking at it, but that's the whole point. Gothic literature is meant to unsettle you. It's kind of meant to take you out of your comfortable position in thought, and it really explores the darker sides of human nature, such as in our case, obsession, madness, isolation, mortality. And in Shelley's case, she uses these Gothic elements to tell a story not just about how science goes wrong, but also about loneliness, rejection, and grief. So when you read Frankenstein, don't just think horror. Think about how these visual and emotional cues from art connect to Victor's internal torment and the creature's suffering overall. Gothic literature and Gothic art, as you see here, is meant to kind of pull us into that emotional depth. Okay. Now, Gothic stories often include some key elements, usually isolated or decaying settings. In our case, think the Arctic or castles or graveyards. They include really extreme emotional states, fear, rage, guilt, characters who are haunted, whether that's physically or mentally. We also see this tension between science and superstition, and dangerous male figures and women in distress. And you'll notice some of these tropes throughout Frankenstein. Okay. Now, critics often describe the Gothic as a reaction to the Enlightenment ideals. Rather than celebrating logic and reason, Gothic novels highlight fear, suffering, and the limits of human understanding. Now, the idea is that humans are deeply flawed, at the mercy of our emotions, nature, and forces that they can't control, such as nature. Now, Shelley taps really, really nicely into this, showing how Victor's pursuit of godlike power really leads only to suffering. Now, Mary Shelley is very, very important in this case. Well, she wrote it, obviously. But her life is very crucial to really understanding Frankenstein. So she's the daughter of two radical thinkers, Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin. And just at 18, she began writing Frankenstein during the summer that we talked about in Switzerland. So this was a summer vacation with Lord Byron and her partner, Percy B. Shelley. And that trip, full of storytelling challenges, they decided to create this competition to see who could write the best horror story. And the gloomy weather that surrounded them really inspired her to write one of the scariest and most enduring horror novels ever written. I mean, we're still reading it today. Now, Mary endured incredible loss throughout her life. She lost several children and eventually her husband. She supported herself as a single mother by writing fiction. biographies, and also editing Percy's poetry. And these experiences really shaped the themes in her novel: grief, birth and recreation, abandonment, loneliness. And in Frankenstein, we kind of feel the weight of those losses. Victor's creation is not just scientific, it is deeply emotional. So we have, again, this layering and this weaving of really complex, opposing emotions. Okay, let's unpack the novel a little bit. So, at first glance, Frankenstein is about a scientist who creates life, but at its core, the novel really is about rejection, fear, and the consequences of trying to play God. Now, Victor's monster is not evil by nature. He's made monstrous by the way that society treats him. And this really raises major questions about identity, morality, and who deserves love and compassion. It also critiques blind ambition. What happens when we pursue knowledge without ethics? Now, some key ideas explored in Frankenstein include obsession, ambition, rejection, isolation, nature versus nurture, ethics and science, etc., so on and so forth. We have a whole list here. Some of the symbols include light, which could mean enlightenment or knowledge; fire, which could mean creation and destruction at the same time. The monster could symbolize the outsider, the rejected. Nature could symbolize a source of peace or power. Ice and cold could reference emotional distance or danger. And these are just a few of them. There's so many more. As you keep reading, you'll run into them. Now, this novel is so important because it really continues to speak on our modern world in really profound and important ways. So globalization is one of those issues. So as we see, Frankenstein's journey goes across Europe into the Arctic, which really reminds us of expanding frontiers and really the consequences of unchecked exploration and power. So think about modern colonization, global inequities, and cultural disruption. Next, we have ethics of bioengineering. Now, Victor essentially creates life through unnatural scientific means. And today we really grapple with CRISPR, cloning, and gene editing. If you don't know what CRISPR is, it's essentially a way for, if parents want, they can give specific genes to their children so they can have, for example, like blue eyes, or they can not have certain disabilities. And that's pretty much what it is. Like, in short, it's more complicated than that, but that's pretty much what it is. And Shelley really asks, just because we can do something, should we do it? And of course, AI, very on brand with this novel. So the creature is this very early version of the created being dilemma, and it becomes conscious, right? We kind of see him developing his own feelings and thoughts. It seeks belonging, but it is ultimately rejected. And so these are really the same questions that we now ask about AI, right? A machine that is learning who we are as humans, how we process emotions, what interests us, etc. And again, it's only getting smarter, I guess you could say. Now, the question here is, what happens when our creations think and feel? Next, we have prejudice and racism. Now, the creature is ultimately rejected solely because of his appearance. Despite his intellect and empathy, he's feared and abused because he looks different. And really, it speaks to how society treats those who are different, especially people in marginalized communities due to race or disability. And then, of course, lastly, the female experience. So in Frankenstein, although female characters are really limited in number, the novel is deeply concerned with creation, reproduction, and absence. Victor literally cuts women out of the process of birth. And Shelley critiques this erasure and raises questions about power, gender, and control. Now, as you read the novel, pay attention to themes. We'll have a lecture on this later on. So consider the topics at hand and how they relate to our world today. So you're going to bring it from 1818 to 2025, okay? So look for specific quotes that highlight a theme so that you can utilize in your paper later on in the semester. So theme elaborates on a topic or issue. So for instance, quest for knowledge or fear of death are topics that we see in Frankenstein. And a theme, however, says something about that specific topic. So a theme would be, for example, an obsessive quest for knowledge that leads to terrible outcomes. So consider the topic of love. So what is a theme about love? Consider the following question. What does the novel say about love? Answer that question. Once you answer that question, you'll kind of begin to develop a theme. Okay, let's recap what we covered. So we reviewed some of the historical context about Shelley romantic literature. We identified some of the key ideas and symbols in the novel. We discussed some modern themes and how Frankenstein speaks to our world today. And we also examined some differences between topic and theme. Thanks for watching, and I will talk to you guys later. Bye.